Uh, Welcome back to the class Critical Race Theory and Politics of Teaching About Racism. This is an interdisciplinary course. We have presenters talking about history, about law, about education, and beyond. Our first two speakers were Professor Paul Ortiz, who gave us an introduction to the genesis of critical race theory and how it affects our view of race and education. Next, we had a presentation by Professor Kevin Brown, one of the original participants in the development of the critical race theory. He gave us an understanding of where it came from, why it was important, and how it developed over the years. Today, we are proud to have Professor Katheryn Brown talking to us about the legal aspects of critical race theory and how it affects particularly university education. Katheryn Russell Brown is the Levin, Mabie and Levin Professor of Law and Director of the Race and Crime Center for Justice at the University of Florida Levin College of Law. She was director of the UF Center for the Study of Race and Race Relations for 18 years. Professor Russell Brown received her undergraduate degree from the University of California, Berkeley, her law degree from the University of California, Hastings, and her PhD in criminology from the University of Maryland. Prior to joining the University of Florida Law faculty in 2003, Professor Russell Brown taught in the Criminology and Criminal Justice Department at the University of Maryland for 11 years. She's been a visiting law professor at American University and the City University of New York. She's also been a lecturer at Howard University, and her first teaching position was at Alabama State University. Professor Russell Brown teaches, researches, and writes on issues of race and crime and the sociology of law. Her article, The Constitutionality of Jury Override in Alabama Death Penalty Cases, was cited in the U.S. Supreme Court 1995 decision Harris versus Alabama. Professor Russell Brown's books include The Color of Crime, which is in its third edition, Criminal Law, Protecting Our Own, Race, Crime, and African Americans, and Underground Codes, Race, Crime, and Related Fires. But perhaps importantly, she's written 5 children's picture books, including Little Melba and Her Big Trombone, A Voice Named Aretha, and She Was the First, The Trailblazing Life of Shirley Chisholm, which won the NAACP Image Award. Her newest children's picture book is Justice Rising, 12 Amazing Black Women in the Civil Rights Movement. Professor Russell Brown.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. It's really exciting to be here, and thanks to each of you for taking some time out of your day to join this discussion and conversation. Thank you, Rick Gold, for the invitation to participate in the Institute for Learning and Retirement, and this is a great honor for me and opportunity to take part in this critical race theory and politics, in the politics of teaching about racism. So thank you again. So I'd like to start off kind of big picture, and as you can see from the screen, there's some art, a photograph of artwork by an artist named Jacob Lawrence, and in this, and it's titled The Library, and he actually has more than one painting titled The Library, but this is the 1961. And you can see here that Black people are sitting, standing, looking. What they're all doing is reading. And so I thought this was kind of an apt introduction to the discussion today about what is appropriate reading and learning, and how some of the things we're seeing today in the state of Florida in particular around prohibitions on certain types of topics are not new, and in fact have an historical legacy. So I'm going to talk about material that is included in an article that I believe is still in the chat. A link to it is still in the chat. And it's a forthcoming article that will be published in the New York University Review of Law and Social Change. Okay. So over the last year and a half or so, we've all watched and listened as school boards, teachers, mayors, parents, governors, students have had heated and sometimes violent arguments about which subjects, what types of assignments can be included as part of public school education. And in these debates, discussions, arguments, three things have stood out to me. First, how quickly legislation has been passed to limit the scope of what's acceptable to teach in the classroom. The challenges to an inclusive, what we would call an inclusive or educational curriculum have quickly turned into legislation where books are being banned and perspectives that are not considered mainstreamed are questioned and delegitimized. And so in Florida a couple of years ago, the state banned the use of critical race theory, as now have several other states, and in particular, the writings from the 1619 Project, with the arguments that that these are distortions of historical events, and that it's that these writings, such as the 1619 Project, are comparable to Holocaust denial. So this is kind of how the frames of this material. So that was one thing, how quickly legislation has been passed. Second, I noted as well the broad sweep of these laws that were being passed. And in particular, we're going to talk about HB 7 today, in particular, that the laws weren't just focused on elementary K through 3 or K through 12 even, not just elementary school, middle school, or high school, but that it has been expanded. These rules, these laws have been expanded to K through 20. So that means undergrad, graduate school, professional school, medical school, law school. So these laws extend to the university classroom, and that's what we're going to focus on today. So the legislation has passed at a lightning speed. The laws have a much broader sweep, a much broader focus. And then also I was been concerned about the potential harmful impact of these laws, that they are designed, or by design, to disappear and to minimize varied racial histories and narratives that challenge mainstream teachings around race and history. And I've worried and really kind of wondered what that would mean for those of us who teach and do research on issues of race and justice. So that motivated me. It's kind of a background to being motivated to take a look at this law, HB 7, which came into effect last July 1 of 2020. 2022. So this legislation stands for, and some of you may have heard of the Stop Woke Law. And what this is what it stands for, Stop the Wrongs to Our Kids and Employees Act. That's what the woke stands for. It's also referred to as the Individual Freedom Act. And so in thinking about this new law, I thought about how historically laws have been used as a tool to prevent literacy. And so there's this well-established history of anti-literacy, and I'm using that as the framework for this research. Okay. And this well-established history of anti-literacy is used using to discuss and evaluate HB 7. Okay, as part of this this big picture of what's being done to alter the reach and scope of public education. So more particularly, I wanted to find the historical, the political, racial grounding for understanding what it means for the state to pass legislation that limits or bans our knowledge and exposure to different bodies of knowledge. Okay? And underneath all of this is a framework that supports critical race theory, which, and I know you've had other classes that have talked about critical race theory, and that's part of what we're looking at, with this idea that racism is a part of the status quo. It's not on the margins. It's part of how this society works. It's part and parcel of it, and that it's permanent. And that there are, critical race theory also argues that there are many stories, not just one master narrative. There are many different ways to evaluate historical events, or unpacking or looking at particular laws, and that one of the goals of critical race theory is to tell the stories and bring to the fore the stories of marginalized communities or groups whose stories and who have not been part of the the major storytelling. Okay. All right. So I wanted to provide a background and history of anti-literacy laws and see how HB 7 might apply in some hypothetical scenarios. So taking a look at that. Okay, so consider prohibitions against reading and writing. Okay. There were laws, antebellum laws, the slave codes, and the Black codes. These existed during the same time frames, but the slave codes were in operation in states that had slavery, and then Black laws were in effect in states that had either outlawed or did not have slavery. So the laws in slave states and free states alike prohibited and restricted education for Blacks. In the 1700s, during the colonial period, some laws distinguished between reading and writing. These were considered separate skills. Reading, in some instances, was permissible, as it would allow enslaved Blacks to read the Bible. This was considered positive, as the Bible was viewed as promoting docility, which was in accord with, right in line with enslavement. Writing, however, was unlawful, as it posed a security threat. It would allow enslaved Blacks to write themselves passes and possibly escape. Okay. Now, in the 1800s, slaveholders and slaveholding states began to treat both reading and writing and learning these skills by enslaved persons as a threat to the continuance of slavery. They considered it subversive. So this led to an increase in slaveholders' opposition to allowing enslaved persons, allowing them to learn to read or write. Okay? And there were fears that enslaved people would come together and plan ways to escape if they were literate, if they were allowed to read, learn to read and to write. There were concerns about the increasing calls for prohibition. Okay? And as well, there were fears that enslaved Christians would lead anti-slavery revolts, such as Nat Turner in Virginia. There were also concerns that writings published by free Blacks who spoke out against slavery, okay, would lead to further unrest. An example of this would be David Walker, who wrote David Walker's Appeal. Okay, and let's look at some examples of some anti-literacy laws in a few of the states. Let's just look at a few of these. Just read. In Virginia, should free Negroes or their children assemble at a school to learn reading or writing, any justice of the peace may dismiss the school with 20 stripes on the back of every pupil. Okay, so this is a kind of corporal punishment, right, for learning to read or to write. In Louisiana, the penalty for instructing a free Black in a Sunday school is, for the first offense, $500. There's a lot of money today, so there was certainly a lot of money at that time. For the second offense, death. Okay. And in North Carolina, a law that said that to teach a slave to read or write, or to sell or give him any book, okay, Bible not accepted, or pamphlet, is punished with 39 lashes or imprisonment. And then depending upon the status of the person by their race, the North Carolina law makes some provisions based on that. So we can see here just some examples of the harsh penalties assigned to enslaved Blacks who might attempt to learn to read or to write. And that these steps were taken to criminalize literacy based on a fear that education and learning would fill an enslaved person with thoughts of freedom, of rights and of justice. Okay. Right now, postbellum, let's look here, just some more paintings that kind of give us just an idea of what reading would look like during this time period. And you have here a man reading a book. We have a woman, looks like she's to the right, being read to by a young person. So some examples here, and that reading really was, and learning to read, learning to write, really could be said to be a revolutionary act. Okay, so revolutionary act for Black people during and after slavery. And following the Civil War, there were a range of laws that prohibited and limited the education of Blacks. Black schools were grossly underfunded. Just see the schoolhouse here. And the schoolhouse was considered, right, a fundamental vehicle for learning how to read, gaining literacy skills, and that meant that it was also a target of attack. There were records of scores of Black schools being burned down, so that the education of Blacks was not possible. One report that more than 600 Black Southern schools were burned down between 1866 and 1876. Okay, and there were other ways that the laws supported and legislation supported the prohibiting of Blacks from reading, or that the laws upheld, excluding Blacks from being allowed to read or write or gain additional knowledge. Okay, oops, well, that won't happen here. So not sure. Well, I'm not sure. Okay, there we go. Okay, so as one example, there was an anti-NAACP oath, and teachers were asked to sign these oaths. These resolutions were passed, saying that any teacher who supports or encourages racially mixed classes would have their license revoked. Okay, so they were asked, do you belong to the NAACP? Do you support the NAACP in any way, through money or through attending meetings? Do you favor integration, racial integration in the schools? Do you believe in the aims of the NAACP? And so here's a picture with this of teachers who were, Black teachers who were members of the NAACP. And I want to note the year. And so this is 1956. This is 2 years after Brown versus Board of Education was decided, right? So the US Supreme Court's decision basically desegregating public education, desegregating of the schools, but here you have teachers being asked to sign these loyalty oaths. So there's this hyper management of what Blacks are allowed to learn. And I think Professor Jarvis Givens does an interesting job of talking about teaching and education, and the way education is learned, the pedagogy, the way material is taught as kind of fugitive pedagogy. Okay, and he examines the ways in which Black educators had to be very creative and to figure out ways in the early 1900s to teach Black children about the history of race in the US and Black achievement. So this idea that, this kind of underground, sort of this underground way in which the history had to be taught because it wasn't considered acceptable, and in fact was often treated as unlawful. Okay. And these teachers, again, were determined to teach Black students about history. So they met, mandate of maintaining an open display of the pre-approved outlines and curriculum, but they also taught another kind of a shadow curriculum, if you will. Okay? And so this led to, these are really legal and social restrictions on learning. And that meant oftentimes that Black education was taught in pieces. So it wasn't, this is, a class like the one that we're in today, right? This whole class, it was pieces here, pieces there, because otherwise they could get in trouble for what they were teaching. Okay, so we can think of these as kind of the ways that the laws were structured. And I just want to say that's kind of a critical piece of critical race theory is acknowledging and seeing how and in what ways the law reinforces discrimination and what that looks like. And so I think this slide does a good job of linking kind of the history of anti-literacy laws with which I'm calling basic anti-literacy laws, with what's going on today. So you've got basic anti-literacy laws. These are slave codes, laws that were in effect during slavery, Black laws, laws that were in effect in states that did not have slavery, Black codes, Jim Crow. But so those are like the laws that we just took a look at, and punishment, physical punishment for teaching literacy. But there are another form of laws, and this is where HB 7 falls, and this is substantive anti-literacy laws. And these substantive anti-literacy laws in some ways are kind of the next level or the next iteration, the next kind of form that we would see anti-literacy laws take in more recent times, whether we're talking about poll taxes or literacy tests that people had to pass in order to exercise basic constitutional rights. Even looking at the loyalty oaths that teachers had to sign. We could look to the rise in school resource officers, like these ways in which we enforce who gets to learn, what they get to learn, who's allowed in the classroom, and under what circumstances, and what are they able to, what is the teaching that is available to them, okay? And so by adapting this second type, the substantive anti-literacy laws, the state is telling us which perspectives are important, and which ones matter, which ones are permissible. Okay? And so now, once this happens, once the state, as we'll get to shortly, HB 7, this language, once the state is actively engaged in telling us what's permissible and what's not in the classroom, then the state is engaged in a form of, or kind of, anti-literacy law, regardless of how it's labeled. As I mentioned a little bit ago, this HB 7 law is known as the Individual Freedom Act. So the fact that it's called that doesn't necessarily mean that it constitutes freedom, right? Because it is a restriction on what's permissible. So I just wanted to share some language from a scholar who's looked at these anti-literacy laws, and from the perspective of history of government promoting literacy through campaigns, or just through universal education, haven't necessarily done so with the view of promoting individual freedom. Rather, they've wished to inculcate, and looking at their political or religious agenda, and promote the state control. Okay, so these bans on educational access, which is what HB 7 does, really are forms of state orthodoxy, that the state wants students to be taught one version of history. Okay. All right, so there are a couple of frameworks, and I already mentioned critical race theory, and that's the main framework here that we're looking at. And here's a photo of Derek Bell, one of the founders of critical race theory, and a quote that the interests of Blacks in achieving racial equality will be accommodated only when it converges with the interests of whites. And this is known as interest convergence theory. Just how is it that we attain racial progress? Okay. All right, so let's look at, I'm trying to move here. Let's see the screen. This, great. here's the legislation, and let's look at it, and then we'll look at some examples. We'll look at some examples of it, of Florida House Bill 7, as I said, passed, made law July 1 of last year. So under HB 7, it is discrimination to subject any student or employee to instruction or training that espouses, promotes, advances, inculcates, or compels such student or employee to believe any of the following concepts. So there are 8 parts to this, so let's just go through them, and we'll say a little bit more about them as we talk through some scenarios. Okay, so under the law, under HB 7, it's discrimination for a professor to teach in a way that compels a student to believe that members of one race, color, national origin, or sex are morally superior to members of another race. Okay, it's also discrimination under the law where a person, by virtue of his or her race, color, national origin, or sex, is inherently racist, sexist, or oppressive, whether consciously or unconsciously. And that's really kind of a direct reference to issues of unconscious bias that have been discussed widely for several years now. Also, it's discrimination under the law for a professor to teach in a way that compels a student to believe that a person's moral character or status as either privileged or oppressed is necessarily determined by his or her race, color, national origin, or sex. 4, members of one race, color, national origin, or sex cannot and should not attempt to treat others without respect to race, color, national origin, or sex. And then 5, that a person, by virtue of his or her race, bears responsibility for or should be discriminated against or receive adverse treatment because of actions committed in the past by other members of the same race. And this looks to be a nod at or a statement that you can't talk about reparations or affirmative action to be covered here. Likewise, 6, a person by virtue of his or her race should be discriminated against or receive adverse treatment to achieve diversity, equity, or inclusion. Again, affirmative action. 7, that a person, and I'm kind of pulling it all in and focusing on the race piece, virtue of his or her race bears personal responsibility for and must feel guilt, anguish, or other forms of psychological distress because of actions in which the person played no part committed in the past by other members of their same racial group. And then last, that it's discrimination to teach in a way that forces a student to believe that virtues such as merit, excellence, hard work, fairness, neutrality, objectivity, and racial color blindness are racist or sexist. Okay. So I know there's a lot here. There's a lot in this legislation. And I want to just highlight that the idea here is, as stated, that you can't talk about these things in a way that force or compel students to believe these things. And to do so, and there's a kind of another piece to the law. It says, but this law can't be construed to prohibit discussion of the concepts listed as part of a larger course of training, so long as these concepts are talked about in an objective manner without endorsement. Well, one of the issues is what does that mean? What does it mean to say, talk about in an objective manner? So it sounds like, and part of the problem is we really don't know, right, what the expanse of the law is. We're still in the early stages of this. But so this idea that you could maybe talk about, for example, reparations, is so long as you also talk about arguments against reparations. But you know, in my experience, anytime you talk about one way of doing something, the other possible ways will always come up, because you're making people are making arguments in response to other arguments. So anyway, I wanted to just share that there's a but to this piece. And so we can see from this language, you know, that there would be cause for pause by many professors in terms of not being clear what's okay to talk about, what's not okay to talk about, and trying to steer clear really of getting into any kind of, violation of the law. So I also wanted to note that, so this discrimination claim for violating the law, that this law itself has many different ways that a person could be punished. It could lead to loss of employment. If a university has a faculty member who has violated the law and they, are not properly sanctioned or punished, the university itself could lose money. There's punitive damages, like there are all these different ways that people can be punished under HB 7. So one of the things I wanted to look at was kind of how this would actually work in the classroom, what it would actually look like in the classroom. And I have some scenarios. I'm maybe just going to go through one or two of them. But so what does HB 7 mean and how expansive is it? So what if, for example, let's see, let's go to, hold on one second. Okay, let's go to this one, scenario number 5. Professor X teaches a death penalty course at a law school. He invites a well-known death penalty defense attorney, someone who defends people charged with, horrific, crimes, capital crimes, to speak with his class. And the guest speaker expresses his opposition to capital punishment and references research studies, empirical studies that show stark racial disparities in the application of the death penalty. For instance, that where there are white victims, those cases are more likely to get the death penalty than when there are Black victims. So what do you do here? Can this death penalty defense person come in and speak with the class? Are they allowed to express their opinion? I mean, these are real questions that professors have. And the guidance from the university, and speaks of the University of Florida, is to send any people who are going to speak in class on issues raised under the law, that they need to be sent the law. Everyone should be sent the law. And if they say something that amounts to compelling a student to believe, certain things, then the professor is supposed to jump in and stop it, if at all possible. Like there are, kind of these series of things. And so what we're hearing is that some professors have said, rather than, sort of try to figure out their way through the law, that they would just rather not, invite someone or take a chance on violating the law. Okay, so what about reparations? Let's see, I think this is, let me go to, The first one, yeah, okay, scenario one. In advance of a discussion on reparations, Professor B assigns an article by author Ta-Nehisi Coates, and the article argues in favor of specific forms of reparations for African Americans. So one question, is that permissible, right, to assign this piece? And then what does that mean to talk about it in to talk about reparations in an objective manner? Some of you may be familiar with the Rosewood case, which there's just a series of events here around town, in particular, marking the 100th anniversary of the Rosewood Massacre. And in that case, it was the first instance of case involving anti-Black violence that resulted in reparations. So is that permissible in terms of a conversation in the classroom, in terms of assigned reading? So there's a lot of questions, and I have several scenarios here, but I'm looking at the time. And what I want to say is that there are a number of concerns that are raised by HB7, and one of the impacts, what I call the domino effects, is that it means that instructors will avoid teaching race-focused courses. They may avoid addressing race issues in a class that may not be about race, but that where racial issues may come up, like constitutional law, for instance. Instructors who are not tenured, who are not on a tenure track, who are adjunct, will be much less likely to talk about any of these issues. So that will mean fewer classes on race, fewer classes that address race issues. And this raises concerns about what is in the toolkit for students who graduate from Florida universities. If they if race is an issue that is not well covered, not covered in a nuanced way because of concerns about violating the law. Okay, and so then how will our students stack up against students from other universities in terms of what they've been exposed to? So concerns about African American studies majors, Latin American studies, African studies. Sort of how far is this? How far is this legislation applicable? And so, in closing, let me just share a quote here. And I'm happy to talk more about some of this. I mean, one of the questions I have here is who's in charge? Like, who gets to decide, what is taught in the classroom? Is it the students, is it instructors, deans, and the board of trustees, the governors, board of governors, the provost, the university president? And I think HB7 really kind of points kind of a laser light on who is in charge. So as I mentioned, concerns about the domino effect of this law, making people reconsider what's taught in a way of delegitimizing or marginalizing race scholarship, and that in turn can lead to ignorance on the part of students. So I'd like to, I don't think I have it here, but I'll just read it to you. That concern that a fully operational HB7 will allow for really a purge or a kind of a disappearing of race scholarship and race scholars, maybe a brain drain from the state of Florida. And it's possible as a result of this targeting of scholars and who conduct scholarship related to race. Okay, and raising questions about the ability of a law such as HB7 to meet the mission of the university. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Professor. We're open to questions, either online or in the audience here at Okamic.
Let's start with John Reiskin. Go ahead if you'll unmute.
Why is this law not clearly unconstitutional with respect to the U.S. Constitution and the 14th Amendment, which applies the Constitution of the U.S. to every state?
Yeah, so thanks for that. That's a great question. Kind of, is this legal? And so, there's been a preliminary injunction, stopping them enforcing the law for now. We'll have to see how it plays out. But First Amendment scholars have said this is, an attempt by the state, and this was in one of the opinions on the injunction in November, that this was an attempt by the state of Florida to have professors or instructors serve as mouthpieces for the state, and that this is not constitutional. So, I mean, I think that's we'll have to see what happens in terms of in the courts. But yeah, I mean, that's a key argument, and also that the focus has been on not just speech in general, but particular types of speech. That it is these are content viewpoint penalties. Right, that people could talk about other things, but that there's this list of items that are not acceptable, and that they're targeted. Thank you.
Thank you. We have several questions, so we'll go back and forth from chat to the Oak Room. So right here in the Oak Room, go ahead.
Yes, I'd like to know how Black teachers were trained going back to maybe 1800 or earlier or later. How were they trained? Were there Black teachers' colleges? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, that's not really my area in terms of kind of all the history, but absolutely. So the development of the historically Black colleges and universities were a source of massive trainings for Black instructors. That was the pipeline. So and the deep segregation that existed, where when school was schools were available, they were going to schools with other Black children, and then in going to college, they were going to Black colleges and learning about teaching there. So in terms of the professional development, yes.
Okay, thank you. We have a chat question. It says, what is the critical criterion for a successful program?
Can you say a little bit more when you say the critical criterion?
Roy, if you'd like to clarify that. Okay, we'll come back to that one. Ophelia, if you'd like to unmute.
Yes.
Oh, wait. Here's Roy. Okay.
All right. Hello.
Ophelia, one moment. I'm sorry.
Oops.
One moment. Roy, go ahead.
Of the various attempts to have a normal school experience, what do you consider to be the critical criterion to indicate that the program is non-biased nor is racially targeted?
How would we know it when we see it? How would we know that a school program doesn't treat people differently or look at people? Is that
right?
Okay.
Correct.
So let me just ask or make a comment about the idea of, being objective and non-biased. I think those are aspirational terms. And by that, I mean, we would all like to think we can not be biased and not, do things that come from a particular perspective that might minimize or treat people differently. But it's a goal, but we're not there yet. And we have a perspective. I'm from, I come from a large city. I'm from the, West Coast. I now live in the South. Like, we bring our experiences all to the table. So I'm saying all this to say, I think that isn't necessarily the goal, is to be completely unbiased. That's a nice ideal, but I don't know that it's an achievable goal, certainly not in a single classroom. But the idea is, I think, to bring in or allow for different perspectives, right? And so in doing so, and I'm not just talking about anybody saying anything, but, scientifically rooted, historically validated perspectives, right? So it's one thing, for instance, if we were talking about enslavement, if you have the ideas, information about people holding other people enslaved, but it's also important to hear narratives, information from the people who are being enslaved. So, having a discussion from one viewpoint is not going to allow us to get closer to something that looks like being objective. Although, I'd like to say that's hard to achieve. We're all coming in with biases, and bias isn't always a negative toward one group. It could be a positive toward another group. Right? So in terms of the hallmarks of a successful program, I'd say, the doors are wide open, and that students are being exposed to, kind of a broad expanse of history, or whatever the topic is.
Thank you.
Ophelia, go ahead. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for your presentation. I learned a lot from it. I'm a retired philosopher, and so some of what really concerns me about this is the problem of orthodoxy, and then I remember, like it just brings me memories of the history of, say, the Catholic Church and the identification over time of various heresies. And they would say, now, if you have this heresy, then you're excommunicated, etc., etc., etc. Or to take it out of a religious context, there's a lot of critiques of foreign governments who have control over what is taught in their universities. And we are completely free to criticize all these governments, accuse them of imposing orthodoxy on their people. But now there is this claim that critical race theory is unorthodox. And so we have to get rid of it in the classrooms. Whereas the method to get rid of it is an even worse orthodoxy, which is by law, people are going to be sanctioned, let's say, on account of not following these relatively narrow concepts of what the meaning of
I think you're right.
Of what our experience is in society. So I am worried about the tolerance. How much tolerance do people have toward the imposition of orthodox?
Yeah, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head in terms of the concerns. And part of what we've seen over the last year and a half or so has been, this outcry about critical race theory, and then people being asked, well, what is it exactly? Well, I don't know, but it's not good. It's something bad. And, oh, well, they're not teaching critical race theory in K through 12, but what they are teaching in some classes is about US history involving African Americans. And, as we've looked more closely at what's going on and, the recent challenges this week to advanced placement course on African American studies being challenged by the state of Florida by the governor, that the concern really seems to be we don't want to allow students to be exposed to different ways of interpreting US history around race. I mean, that seems to be what the real concern is. So, you can call it critical race theory, you can, and I urge anyone who's, hasn't looked at the 1619, like you open it and you go, what's the issue here? There are different essays and, so what is it? But it seems that it's a concern about different different ways of recounting, US history.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Another chat says, have UF professors indicated they will leave the university, and will the university be downgraded?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. It's a question a lot of people have. And yeah, I mean, there are, you talk to people at universities, other universities outside the state of Florida. Yeah, people have definitely, this is a concern, and people have expressed concerns about coming to the state of Florida. And people, I mean, I can only speak to, people that I've talked to have expressed concerns about leaving. Because one of the things I didn't get a chance to talk about, but in addition to HB7, there are other things going on at the university. So there's been, and this isn't new, but there's now a focus on, evaluating people who have received tenure, like a stricter, a more, more intense review. And the inability to appeal the outcome of the review. There's changes in, vote with regard to voting rights in terms of, districts, concerns about gerrymandering. There's concerns about, LGBTQ issues. So there's, several convergences. So not just HB7, but concerns about climate. So. Yeah, I think, who knows, but people are watching, people are aware of what is going on, and it's, it's been something.
Okay, Jana, if you'd like to go ahead.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. But many laws, I think, are difficult to understand and interpret for a wide variety of reasons. Either they're complex or they're poorly written, or one possible reason is that they are purposefully made difficult to interpret and apply in order to have a chilling effect or for political purposes, which to me seems to fit the bill here. There's nothing that about this entire piece of legislation that to me seems easy to interpret, but one of the pieces that really has me concerned is this issue of compelling students to believe. What does that mean, and how do teachers compel students to believe, and how could you ever prove that a student had been compelled to believe something?
Yeah, I think you've hit,
if my math teachers had compelled me to believe math, I might be better at it today. Apparently that didn't work out so well. But
yeah, no, I think you've hit the nail on the head.
Right. What's your reaction to the compelling to believe part?
Well, and that's a key question. And so that's what I was suggesting is that since we don't really know what that means, then, hey, people will want to back up and not do anything that looks like. So, I mean, it's kind of like, one man, it's an expression from one of the Supreme Court justices, one man's treasure is another man's junk, right? And so who knows where that line is? So I'm in class, I'm learning about all this history and I'm getting all this new information. And am I feeling like the teacher's compelling me to believe it? Or do I feel like the teacher is sharing information with me that I can then think about, critique, and discuss on my own? So, I mean, I think that is exactly part of it, is trying to figure out what does it mean to compel, and to that point, I don't know professors who are compelling students to believe things. Does simply teaching material from a particular perspective mean you're compelling them to believe things? And I think that's where the concern is, that, oh, my reading list will somehow get me in trouble. Or maybe I can assign material, but then not talk about it in class. Because one of the things the law suggests is that we're not supposed to share our opinion about things. So, which is an odd thing, right? So people go to school for years to get their PhDs or, whatever, teaching credential, and then we're supposed to, come to conclusions based on, information, discipline-wide standards, practices, all of that, but then not be able to share an opinion based on, on research with students.
Thank you. Back here in the Oak Room, go ahead, Roy.
We have a very recent response to the impact on recruitment, because Professor Brown, who spoke to us 2 weeks ago, said that he had an offer from UF, which he was considering.
Yeah.
And the day that House Bill 7 was signed, he made his decision not to come to the University of Florida. So we know it has already had an impact.
Yep. You're right. You're absolutely right.
All right, back to John on Zoom.
Yes. Finally, this great presentation. A lot of us are really concerned about this. And I mean, if a teacher even rolls her eyes on a statement, he or she could get into trouble. How should we try to communicate our concern to the public? I mean, the governor is very popular. This aspect of his approach is very offensive to us and offensive to much of the country. And we feel kind of powerless in exactly how to approach it. What would you recommend our action, what we should do about this?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's, a lot of different things that could be done. I mean, writing letters to the editor, writing op-eds, going to school board meetings, going to, writing in a comment after an article that you've read online. I mean, many of us don't, we don't have like a microphone that, a million people are going to hear, but I think it's the small things, writing to, the school board if you can't attend a meeting. I mean, I think there have to be other voices that are part of this. And again, we're talking about teaching history. Like, this isn't some, unknown, newfangled, information. It's information that hadn't been taught, but it's not new information. So I do think there are different things that, that we can do, but mostly talking about it, because one of the things that is concerning is that all these things are happening, and, and I do wonder, going back to the earlier question about, people walking away from the university, not coming or leaving.
Yeah.
Thank you. Back to you, Rick.
Thanks so much. I appreciated your approach of looking at this whole set of issues from an anti-literacy perspective, going back hundreds of years. But literacy from that perspective is quite a general concept. in terms of not just reading and writing, but a whole set of denial of interest and denial of knowledge to certain sectors of the population. Could you examine HB 7 from that perspective?
When you say from the perspective of denial, can you say a little bit more about that perspective of denial of education?
Right. So if, why would there be an interest in the legislature denying people the right to appropriately look at their history from multiple points of view?
Oh, okay. So why, so basically a question of why do we have this kind of legislation? Okay, if I'm understanding you correctly. Well, it demands new knowledge and processing new knowledge and thus new approaches, right? So if we know the horrors of the Holocaust, if we know the horrors of chattel slavery in the US, well, we have laws. Are there laws we can deal with that address those concerns? So I think a lot of this is a concern that this rewriting of history, then it changes people's placement in history. Right. So you remember when, first, kind of broad scale reporting about Thomas Jefferson and having, forced sexual relation, is an enslaved person able to say no, yes, with Sally Hemings and, no, that never happened, that didn't happen. This, this is it's a forcing of, or perceived as forcing of additional information, and many people are, we're kind of, we feel like we're bound with the history that we were raised on, and may not want to think differently about whether this is a good person or a bad person, or a good person who did bad things, or, it requires some willingness to think differently about what constitutes a hero. Do we care what people do in their private lives as opposed to what they, so there's all these different issues. So in short, in response to your question, I think it challenges people's place in the universe, and thinking about, who should be exalted and whether or not people should be exalted in terms of the history.
Oh, one more question here.
No, you are not getting in, sweetie. I don't think you're.
Thank you.
It's unmuted, Audrey. It's unmuted.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. But it seems to me we're not going to know where we are with this law until we get to the courts with it. And it seems to me that we need to figure out how to get some of the cases in front of the judges to see where this thing all ends up, because without that, we're totally in the dark as to what's going to happen.
Yeah, you're right. And the cases are winding their way through the Florida courts. There's a ongoing case with Judge Mark Walker, who issued a preliminary injunction. I mean, we're just at the beginning stages. So you're right, though, that the courts are involved and the courts will rule. And who knows, right? I mean, the speculation is, in terms of, running for president next year, we'll have to see where all this lands, where all this goes.
Dr. Russell Brown, if you have time for one more question, it says
Sure.
iPhone. So whoever that is on Zoom, if you'd like to unmute.
Okay.
This is me, I think. Paul Crouch, hello?
Wait 1 minute, Paul. We have another one here. iPhone, go ahead.
Yes, I think the bigger problem is convincing people who vote for politicians who support these kinds of things. People seem to, like, they'll vote for a conservation bonding 85%, and then they'll turn around and vote for legislators who will do everything they can to undo it. And I think that's the bigger problem. And I'm not sure that's solvable
Well, I think what's heartening to me is to see the number of you who, are participating today, because it's also this idea of, is anyone, who's paying attention, right? Who's interested in these issues, who wants to know more, who wants to do something. And it's sometimes it's hard to tell because we're all so busy. We all have so much, going on, and it's overwhelming, right? So I think part of it is the idea of getting information, getting more people interested in what's actually happening, because it's not clear that the electorate, just how aware people are, right? Who aren't already teachers, who aren't already students, who aren't professors.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and our final question, Paul?
Yeah, thank you. A wonderful presentation, and thank you for your courage in doing this. My wife and I are both licensed social workers, and back on my curriculum at VCU, Virginia Commonwealth University, we took a course called the Black Experience. I just looked at the curriculums for Florida State University and VCU. Florida State has nothing to do with social justice. VCU still does. It's already impacting my profession. I'm ashamed to see that. That's all.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's, yeah.
It's happening.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Professor Russell Brown, for an intriguing, thoughtful presentation and dealing with this issue in a very courageous manner. And we'll be back next week with Paul Ortiz again to talk about how universities around the country are dealing with these issues. Thanks so much.
Thank you again, Dr. Russell Brown.
Thank you. I enjoyed speaking with you.
Thank you.